This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you all for joining us again, and we just want to really give our appreciation to those of you who have been tuning in. We find that we're reaching a larger and larger audience, and we're very pleased about that, and we want to continue to. So we want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to leave a review on iTunes or Google Play, and hopefully we can reach a wider audience. And speaking of which, there will be stickers coming out soon, so you can put them on all your cars and laptops and all the rest, and so we're very excited about that. Even if you're not.
Get our three handsome faces out there for people to see on the on your laptop when you're sitting in a coffee shop, and flip it open there, and people can get a good look at us.
To be clear, it'll be the silhouette one, not our actual faces, so we won't scare off too many people.
That's why I said handsome. Makes us look a lot better than we are.
And to our real topic of the day.
Speaking of Satan,
we're continuing our mini-series on Satan in the Bible.
Can we call it mini at this point? I mean, it's going on for a while.
Well, by the time it's done, it might be a mega series.
Yeah.
And just to kind of transition, one of the exciting things for us as voices in the podcast is the conversations we're having not only after class, but after podcast.
Yeah.
People stopping by my office, you're running into people in the store or old friends who are asking you questions about the podcast.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I've been in coffee shops where somebody will walk up to me and carry on the conversation or ask a question or even give a compliment, hanging out with friends. And so it's heartwarming to me to know that people are listening and are interested enough to have an ongoing conversation on some of these topics. And apparently we've got one today that ties right into what we're talking about.
Yeah, so someone's been listening faithfully to every episode, and they've followed up with a question. And we've stated in our podcast that engaged Ezekiel, we suggested that the cherub in the garden in Ezekiel refers to the king of Tyre. And that account should not be mistaken to be an origin of the devil sort of account. And someone stopped by and asked a really good question. And he said, John, I get that this is about the Prince of Tyre. But, one of the things about Scripture is sometimes passages have dual meanings, double meanings. And one of the examples he thought of was the Emmanuel prophecy of Isaiah, that in its original context is talking about a child that would be born in the context of the Syro-Ephraimite War. That would mean the end of the alliance of the northern kingdom and Syria against Judah. And that prophecy was fulfilled in its time period as those two kingdoms came crumbling down. And yet Matthew draws upon that same passage to talk about how Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us.
Yeah.
Which we all affirm.
Right, exactly.
And so this passage had an original meaning in its context and an extended, fulfilled meaning through Jesus. And that sort of thing happens several times in the New Testament as it appropriates certain Old Testament passages.
Yeah, I like to use the word reappropriates. So the New Testament writers reappropriated those passages for their modern context to talk about Jesus or whatever else. And so those are clear examples of when that happened. Because Matthew especially says, as it has been written, so that it will be fulfilled. And the implication is we're taking this one passage and now we're doing something slightly different with it. And so he's very clear when he does that.
Yeah, I even have a book on my desk right now I'm using for one of my classes, Richard Hayes' book, Reading Backwards, where he talks about this kind of figural language, where something from the Old Testament prefigures something we encounter in the New Testament, but it isn't a prophecy, but in hindsight, and that's one of the things he emphasizes, you realize in hindsight, wow, something happened in the life of Jesus that directly connects and opens up and expands what we saw in the Old Testament. The Hosea 11:1 passage where God says of Israel, out of Egypt I called my son, which nobody would have seen that as a messianic kind of a prophecy. But when Jesus' parents take him to Egypt to escape Herod, and when Herod dies, they come back to Judea from Egypt. The New Testament writers, Matthew looks at it and goes, oh my gosh, something happened in Jesus' life that paralleled Israel and what God said through Hosea 11. And so this becomes now a figure, and now it has this new expanded meaning that goes beyond, but still directly correlates this Old Testament passage and what happened in the life of Jesus.
Yeah. So since there is this legitimate hermeneutical move that's taken by New Testament authors to reappropriate passages from the Old Testament, it becomes a valid question. Is it possible that this King of Tyre passage in Ezekiel, or maybe even the morning star passage in Isaiah, it has a dual meaning as well? It not only meant these ancient kings who lived and died a long time ago, but also refers to Satan. Brilliant question. And worth just pausing, and if this person had this question, probably some of our listeners have the same question. Sam, you want to give a crack at maybe how you might respond to that question?
Sure. I would say that, yes, it's possible, but in order to make the case, we'd have to have clear usage of the New Testament writers in the same way. So like I said, Matthew will say, so that it might be fulfilled, and then he'll quote clearly an Old Testament passage and apply it to Jesus. And do we see that with these texts specifically, or any text about Satan done by the gospel writers especially? And as far as I can tell, the answer is no. At no point does a gospel writer say, so that might be fulfilled, and the King of Tyre passage, for example, maybe even a snippet is quoted and then says, and this is what this Satan is doing now. We don't find that. And so while a lot of interpreters might be nice to appropriate certain things in that way, we need to follow the example of the New Testament writers, and they don't do that. That's not how they view the Satan figure, or at least that's not how they characterize him in their writings.
Yeah, there would have to be something in the New Testament that occurred that took us back to that Old Testament passage and said, wow, look at the connection. It's like when we already cited Jesus and his parents sojourning in Egypt and then coming back to Judea. That's an event that actually occurred in Jesus' life that now becomes a parallel to what happened in Israel's history that Hosea specifically addresses. And so you have a New Testament event that you can connect to this Old Testament passage. What is the New Testament event, or even a statement by a New Testament writer that corresponds, that says something about Satan does something, or we hear something about him, and then we can connect that. We just don't have anything like that in the New Testament, in my opinion. And so while in theory the passages like in Ezekiel or Isaiah, in theory, could they have a dual meaning, an extended meaning? Sure, theoretically they could, but what becomes the justification of interpreting that way? And unlike the stuff we see in Jesus' life, I don't think we have anything in the New Testament that would justify that move.
Yeah, so it requires both the Old Testament statement and a New Testament event that is saying something rather clear. Mm-hmm. In the New Testament we have, Jesus clearly came out of Egypt. Jesus clearly came as Son of God. So now you can go back to Old Testament passages that talk about people coming out of Egypt and sons of God being sent by Jesus, being sent by the Lord to deliver his people. Then you can make connections. But with the Satan passage, we don't have the New Testament passage that talks about his fall out of heaven because of pride.
Yeah.
That we can then say, this was anticipated way back in Isaiah's day.
Someone might bring up, what about Luke 10:18, where Jesus says to his disciples, I saw Satan fall like lightning out of heaven. They say, isn't that the same thing? How would you all respond to that question?
In my own, just thinking about that connection, I don't think it's a very strong connection. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. To me, that's just too loose. It's not a strong enough connection in my mind.
It's referring to the disciples' mission, right? Mm-hmm. They're going out in their kind of trial, Great Commission, and they're preaching the gospel, and they're healing the sick, and they're casting out demons. And when they come back from this mission, Jesus compliments them and says basically, "Hey, you gained ground for the kingdom." Mm-hmm. For the kingdom of God, which means the kingdom of this world is losing ground. And to that extent, you can say, look at Satan lose ground. Look at him lose his footing. Look at him fall from the sky.
Right.
And so in this case, the event that's being referred to is the disciples' proclamation and demonstration of gospel kingdom power. It's not a reference to Satan and God had a fallout in the heavenlies, and then God expelled him, and now he's coming down to the ground.
Yeah, Jesus' statement is not a statement of origin, but wow, look at Satan is being defeated. He's in the process of falling because of the work that you're doing.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Great reference.
Yeah, I would agree with you.
No,
that would be one thing that people would bring up. And I'd also say that, again, it doesn't have sort of the formulaic usage that we see in the rest of the gospel writers. It's Jesus saying this, which usually it's not Jesus saying it. It's a gospel writer quoting someone. Yeah. And again, there's no explanation. So a lot of the elements that we see in these other dual purpose accounts, it's not found here.
Yeah, and again, the Jesus sojourning in Egypt thing, I mean, the parallels are so strong. I mean, it's like his birth narrative, Israel sojourning in Egypt. That's part of their origin story. It's almost sounds like a Marvel comic book movie or something like that. But, it's an origin story of Jesus paralleling Israel. And, you don't see that in the Luke statement, Jesus statement in Luke. It's not an origin statement.
So you're saying Jesus was bitten by a radioactive spider? That's how he could do miracles?
No, he's super smart and built a suit of armor that he flies around in.
Cool.
It's his intelligence that is...
Because he's a craftsman of some sort of woodworker. He made a wood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, he was a carpenter, so it was made out of wood.
Right.
Okay. Well, what I love about this question is it does make a great segue from what we've been talking about in previous weeks, which is how Satan is and is not talked about in the Old Testament and the Second Temple Jewish literature. What did Ron call it?
Post-Old Testament?
The post-Old Testament books. To the New Testament.
Never going to live that down.
So I appreciate the engagement and that opportunity to clarify, but I hope that clarification was helpful for you. So we've sampled what's in the Old Testament, and we've sampled from the Second Temple Jewish literature, and out of it comes possible ways of thinking about and referring to Satan or the devil. And I just want to list several possible ways that we could interpret New Testament passages that refer to the devil or Satan or the evil one or the prince of the power of the air, right? There are all sorts of different phrases.
The body of lexical designations for him really expands when you get into the New Testament, and that's what makes it a little bit of a challenge of a study. You can't just look for occurrences of Satan. You got to look for devil or diabolos.
Beelzebub.
Yeah, Beelzebub in a couple places. So, you have so many different terms now that are being used to designate him.
Yeah, so by the time of the New Testament writers, there's been enough written, enough imagined, both in the Old Testament and these other books, that there are various options. And our task, I think, is in part to read through the New Testament passages and say which of these options growing out of the intertestamental time period seems to be how the New Testament talks the most about the devil. One option is that the devil just means what the word means, is a slanderer.
Yeah.
Right.
It's that Greek word diabolos. And people will recognize that. You hear English versions of that. And words like, diabolic, things come from that basic root. But mostly, it means to slander. What's kind of interesting, you see how it's used is in 1 Timothy when he says to the women who are going to be deacons that they're not supposed to be gossips or something like that. He actually uses the word diabolos. Don't be diabolos. Don't be slanderous in your speech. And that gives us a little hint into the usage and meaning of that particular term.
Yeah, it could be translated, don't be devils, with a lowercase d.
Yeah, don't be devilish. Yeah, quite literally.
Yeah. So that's one possible use we can see of Satan language and devil language, that the terms could actually mean what the terms mean.
Right.
And they're not at all talking about some kind of evil figure in the world beyond an average human who's being slanderous. Another possibility, and we saw this, and this possibility comes out of books like The Life of Adam and Eve, the Greek version of which is The Apocalypse of Moses, and Second Enoch, a book I didn't talk about last time but has a similar account. where these books that are on the fringe of Jewish orthodoxy, most of them came out of Egypt, where kind of a dualistic view of all reality was prevalent. And in that literature, Satan is presented as someone who got kicked out of heaven by God because he refused to worship humans, and therefore he's bent on avenging himself against the humans who brought about his fall from heaven. So we can look for, is this avenging Satan present in the New Testament anywhere? A third option is the kind that we often see in fiction, both Christian and non-Christian fiction, that Satan, it could be an enemy of God, an arch nemesis of, even if he doesn't have equal power, certainly like of amazing power, almost like omnipresent, omniscient, able to get inside everywhere and every place in multiple places at once. This kind of like uber opposite divine God figure. That, and the key characteristic of this would be who is God's enemy.
Yeah.
And only really against humans to the extent that God is for us.
And I think that is to me the big pop culture Satan or devil. You see it in heavy metal album covers and movies and Dungeons and Dragons or wherever you want to look. Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, things like that. That to me is I think the image that most people have, and it's because it is the one that dominates what you see in popular media and entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I call this one the Bizarro Superman or the Bizarro Satan. Like it's everything Superman / Satan except the opposite.
Yeah.
So same power, but and that's how it's framed. Like you mentioned, the omnis that we talk about God with. A lot of times it's framed that Satan can do these things too. People wouldn't say he's God, but like somehow Satan can be everywhere. Like, is that a thing?
Yeah.
So this is the enemy of God version.
Right.
And look for that. And this, I can't go anywhere in the intertestamental literature or the Old Testament to find this. Mm-hmm. You can look in Persian Zoroastrianism, where they have a good God and an evil God framework where they both have kind of equal power. But it's really tricky even dating when these two alter ego gods existed, because Persian literature is notoriously difficult to date.
So it sounds like a yin and yang type situation.
Yeah, I thought that exactly.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's no precedent so far in Jewish literature that I've ever seen.
And that's our source. That's our authoritative source.
Yeah. Another view that grows out of our discussion of Job and Zechariah and First Chronicles is that Satan could be a negative divine functionary who still works for God on the payroll, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But his function seems to be very negative, like to accuse people of their sinfulness or to be their adversary. And so the view of a negative divine functionary, but very much still on God's payroll. And I would broaden this to say, even if he doesn't always do his job perfectly, right, or gets too big for his britches, or even though his job is supposed to be in service to God, that maybe sometimes he exceeds the bounds of that service, but is still nonetheless functioning for God.
So while we may not like him and we may not like what he does, he's still doing God's will, even if, as you say, not perfectly all the time.
Yeah, enemy of us, but not God.
But that's what he's supposed to be doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then another view is Satan as figurehead of the kingdoms of this world, of all unbelievers and all their evil ways and all wickedness. And this is the image that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We saw that in the, what was the battle passage called? Dead Sea Scrolls.
The War
Scroll, thank you.
Yeah.
And we saw there that the kingdom of Beliar, or Belial, those are used interchangeably, is all the kingdoms of this world outside of the kingdom of Israel and God's faithful chosen remnant, the Essene community, right? Yeah. And Satan is kind of a figurehead for all the dominions outside of God's specific people, and then represents all the wickedness that is done by their kings, by their rulers, and by their sinful citizens. And so a figurehead for wickedness, but in particular wickedness connected to unbelief and world kingdoms outside of and in rebellion to God's own kingdom. And finally, there is the lens of tempter. And we're going to see a lot of passage in the New Testament that refers to the devil as a tempter. That itself doesn't tell us where he came from, what his motive is, because the image of tempter could be he's tempting as a function of being a divine representative who is tempting someone to see whether they pass the test, almost like we're going to talk about the wilderness temptation of Jesus. He could be tempter working for God, exposing human sinfulness where it is really there. But he could also be tempter as figurehead of evil and all wickedness in the world, not just exposing people's evil desires, but promoting evil desires almost, right? He could also be tempter from the perspective of avenger of God, avenger of himself against God's people. He could also be tempter from the function of being an enemy and arch rival of God. And so the tempting label doesn't really tell us what his overall function is. He could be tempting on behalf of God, or he could be tempting in opposition to God.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a pretty subjective one where you could view it in all of those, but you don't. Yeah. If it just says he's tempting, we don't know in what way. So it's hard to really nail that one down.
So those are just a variety of ways that Satan could be functioning in the New Testament, growing out of how we see him functioning in the Old Testament and Second Temple Jewish literature. And the question is, what do we see in the New Testament? Which of these categories seem to fit best? Which of them don't? And I'm going to pass the baton to Ron, who's our resident New Testament scholar, and he's going to kick us off with some Gospels analysis.
Yeah, and so tying into what you were talking about there, this idea of him being the tempter, a little bit of lexical study has yielded some interesting results here. In the New Testament, one of the primary words that is used for temptation, the Greek verb pirazo, it's a really interesting word because there's a little bit of ambiguity with regard to the negative idea of temptation. In certain instances, pirazo can definitely mean tempt in the way that we would think of, which we would normally interpret as a negative thing. It's to draw someone towards something that they shouldn't be drawn to, or that's negative or bad for them. But in other places, the word can simply mean test in a much more neutral sense. And it's really interesting because in James chapter 1, at the beginning of that chapter, James says, "Count it all joy when you encounter various kinds of trials, and to see them as testing, and to be glad when it happens because you're being tested, and that produces good fruit." And then later on in the same chapter, he says, "But don't ever say that God is tempting you." And he uses the exact same verb. And so one place it has more of a neutral or maybe even slightly positive idea, and the other place it's more negative. But one of the definitions is with regard to testing. It means this. I got this from the Lowenite lexicon. For those of you who know Greek lexicons,
The best of the lexicons.
as far as I'm concerned, yeah.
Wow.
So the definition, one of the definitions they provide, depending on the context, is to try to learn the nature or character of someone or something by submitting such to thorough and extensive testing. So once again, to try to learn the nature or character of someone or something by submitting such to thorough and extensive testing.
So let's put that in non-nerd terms. It's what we as teachers do.
Yeah.
We give tests not to ruin our students' lives,
Even
though they
think
may
that.
feel that
Yeah.
way. That's not our goal. It's to see whether they have the merit to pass the class. Have you learned the material we're trying to get across, and can you formulate that in writing?
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do. We're not bringing pain. Well, we are, but not intentionally. It's just to see whether they're good enough to keep going. Right?
Yeah, you want to find out. You're kind of finding out what they're made of. Mm-hmm. You want to find out character or nature, and so testing. You find out what's going on there, and to me, that's very interesting when we think about what we saw in Job or even Zechariah and Satan's function, especially in Job's situation. His function there was to test Job, basically to find out what he was made out of. He brought this slanderous accusation, hey, Job only worships you, God, because you give him goodies, take away the goodies, and he'll curse your name. And God said, let's find out what he's made of. And so his function is to put him to the test to find out what he's made of. And that brings us to a very interesting way of looking at his function the first time we encounter him in the Gospels, and that is in the wilderness temptation of Jesus. I think that Christians in general, and I certainly have approached it this way, when we see the wilderness temptation, our natural assumption is that he's tempting him, and that's often the way it's even headlined.
With the negative connotation.
Yeah, right. Jesus is being tempted. And I think that's legit. He certainly is being tempted. Satan is offering him things that Jesus rightly should say no to. And so it is a temptation, but it's more than just temptation for temptation's sake. He's not just trying to cause him to stumble. We could argue. I'm not necessarily making that argument, but we could argue his goal is not merely to make him to stumble or to bring about his failure, but maybe he's continuing this function that we saw in Job, a little bit in Zechariah, that his job is also, let's find out what Jesus is made out of. Let's submit him to thorough testing to find out what he's made out of. And in that, we see Satan, I think, functioning in a way that's consistent with what we see in the Old Testament. But I think in addition to that, we do see some added material there because he makes this reference of, when he tempts Jesus to, bow down and worship me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world because they've been given to me. We begin to see that element of Satan as being this principality and power, ruler of the air. I don't know if I'm using the right language there. But anyway, this world kind of ruler, this person who has governing authority over a kingdom that we don't really see in the Old Testament. And so we see a little bit of that, I think, come out in that story as well.
Yeah, I think there are three pieces of background information that lend toward your interpretation of that passage. I mean, one, we have the testing of Abraham. We saw God, test him.
Mm-hmm.
What is Abraham made of?
Yeah.
Go sacrifice your son. Do you really believe that the promise that I've given you is going to be fulfilled by God's power or by Abraham's power? It's a turning point in his life.
Yeah.
And in that passage, at least in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, God's the agent.
Yeah.
God instigated it. Then we ran into with the parallels in with David, where God incited him to take a census because God was angry with Israel. Mm-hmm. And in the Chronicles version, we have the accuser, right?
Yeah.
Incited David to take a census. And here you have, again, God as the cause, but it's identified with Satan in a certain way, at least the term Satan. And this is one that he fails. Unlike Abraham, who passes, David fails. And so it results in him failing the test. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to Jesus, is there reason to believe that here's just the devil trying to take Jesus out early?
Right, yeah.
Or is something else going on? And I think Matthew gives us that information. That
yes, he does.
It is after Jesus comes out of the waters of baptism, it is the Holy Spirit, right?
Exactly.
Do you have this passage in front of you?
Yeah, yep. Matthew 4:1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted.
Yeah.
I mean, he was specifically led by the Spirit into the wilderness for this very purpose. And should we translate to be tempted, or is it to be tested? And now Satan comes in and performs his function, maybe a God-assigned function, since the Holy Spirit orchestrated this event.
Yeah. God's behind this either way. There's no way around it. And whether he's using Satan's evil plot to overthrow Jesus at the beginning, or whether he's using Satan the way he always uses Satan, to do that testing, to do that tempting. And I do want to, you referenced the James passage that God tempts no one,
right,
and no one should claim that God is tempting them. We turn that into an absolute statement in ways that I think contradict some of what the Old Testament portrays God as doing. And I think it's helpful to note what's going on in the book of James, and it might diffuse some of that tension here. And that is, in the book of James, you have certain Christians that are upwardly mobile. They're trying to make a living for themselves. They want to travel. They want to make money. They want to get rich. It's a big theme in James.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
And it appears to be that some people in that congregation are claiming that their get-rich-quick schemes are providential opportunities given to them by God. God wants me to get this job so I can make a lot of money and get rich so that then I could be so much more of a blessing to the church. You've ever heard that kind of language?
Never heard that before. No, people don't say that.
I think a valid reconstruction of what James is actually talking about is that there are people who are claiming that their selfish opportunities to get rich and advance themselves in the world, they're claiming them as being gifts from God. And then James has to clarify, hey, God only gives good and perfect gifts. Don't claim that what this opportunity is not a gift from God. It's a temptation of your own selfish desire. Mm. And God doesn't tempt people.
Right.
What you're calling a gift is actually a temptation. You're giving God credit for giving you these opportunities when they're really coming from your own selfish desires. So it's not a blanket statement about God's never involved in the testing process.
Right, yeah, good point.
It's a statement of don't claim what is your own selfish desire as being a gift and opportunity from God, because that kind of thing you're trying to do, that kind of agenda that you have, is not the thing that God gives his people.
I think you all have made a very good case, and about how, especially this episode in Matthew 4 should be viewed. And but I wonder if it's so new and startling to some of our listeners that maybe reframing another way might be helpful. So I was wondering if we could view it. Have you guys ever, when you were younger, try out for a team? Go through tryouts for any sort of sporting event?
I was so unathletic.
I have, yes.
How was that? Was that really an enjoyable experience?
It was grueling.
It was grueling.
There may have been vomiting.
And what was the reason for all that? For the coach to see whether you had enough, whether you were good enough to be on the team.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right? And so here you're, competing, you don't hate the coach, and the coach isn't trying to kill you. He's just saying, we're trying to put together the best team we can have, and we want the best players. And so give me your best, and let's see where it falls. And so if you can imagine God being in the coach position, or perhaps even in this case, maybe the assistant coach would be Satan, who's putting you through those grueling things. That's what he's doing with Jesus. He's putting through the rigor to say, okay, are you going to tap out? Are you going to give me your best? Are you good enough to be on this team? And of course, he comes through with flying colors. Yeah. You might also, another illustration might be like boot camp type situation.
Yeah.
I mean, those guys and girls are just put through hell, if you pardon the pun, but because, they're going to be in situations where they need the best and they don't need slackers.
Right.
And so those slackers will wash out. So I don't know if that helps at all, but just sort of reframe it for what we're talking about, because this is a very different approach than most people have to the temptation account.
Yeah.
And reframing it, helps. Okay, well, if we see this episode in that way, then what does that do for the other times we encounter Satan?
And I wonder if that's what Jesus has in mind in Luke 22:31 when he says to Peter that, Satan wants to sift you. Is he saying Satan wants to put you to the test? He wants to thoroughly test you to find out what you're made out of. And in a sense, Peter doesn't do as well as Jesus did when he went through the testing, But sometimes, I tell students this sometimes. Sometimes failure is just a learning opportunity. Sometimes you fail, and then you got to go back and go, okay, why did I fail? What happened here? And how can I succeed later on? So I wonder if that helps to understand Jesus' words to Peter in that situation.
Yeah, and while we're talking about Peter and Jesus and tempting and Satan, I think it's helpful to be specific about what were the kinds of temptations Jesus was given in the wilderness. And it was really, they were questions about what kind of king are you going to be?
Yeah.
Are you going to bring God's kingdom God's way, or are you going to go about a worldly kingdom agenda the way the world does it? And so, when Satan offers the kingdoms of this world, it's not like he has the kingdoms and he can give Jesus a pair of keys and all of a sudden now you're in charge. What he's offering is you can have the kingdoms of this world the way that you can get them through the power of Satan. You can get them the way world powers get kingdoms. You can get the kingdoms of this world by overcoming them with greater force.
Like the nations do.
Like the nations do. It is a temptation to be a king like the nations, to take control of the kingdoms of this world by force and by death, because that's the only power that the nations have to claim the kingdoms of this world. And that's the kind of power, since the nations are portrayed here as being under Satan, that he can give Jesus access to. Yeah. And so it's interesting that when Jesus says to Peter later on after the great confession, "You are the Christ," right? Yeah. And Peter said, and then Jesus says, "But you're going to have to suffer, and I'm going to have to suffer." Sorry, and bad things are going to happen to me as Messiah. Yeah. Peter's like, "No, they won't. I won't let that happen." Well, how is he going to not let that happen? Right. By using the sword,
right? Exactly.
To defend the Messiah and to advance the Messiah's kingdom. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Yeah. Because his offer to defend and advance God's kingdom through violence and force was the same offer that the devil was giving in the wilderness. Yeah. And then that plays forward to the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Where Jesus is agonizing in the Garden of Gethsemane. There was this movie about the last temptation of Christ. Mm-hmm. Oh, the temptation here was the last temptation of Christ. He was crying drops of blood because he was wrestling with whether he was going to go forward with the cross. Yeah. And what we seldom think about is, well, what was the alternative to being captured and being put on the cross? It was to take the swords and call on the heavenly legions or do whatever to overcome the Roman legion that was coming with a greater show of force and take the kingdoms of this world by force. That was the temptation that was on the table for Jesus. Yeah. And so it's no wonder as soon as the legion shows up, what does Peter do?
He draws his sword,
Draws out his sword. Yeah. I think these events are connected in a kind of wider arc. The temptation of the devil for Jesus was concrete about how he was going to be a king, what kind of kingdom he was bringing. And Peter represented Satan when he represented the world's way of doing it.
Yeah. I think that's why Matthew loves the designation kingdom of heaven. He leans really heavy on that term, unlike the other gospel writers. And the whole idea is this is a radically different kingdom with a radically different value system and a radically different way of going about its business. And he wants his readers to really get that. And so Kingdom of Heaven says, we don't do things like the nations. We're not like the Roman Empire. We don't have the same aspirations as the Jewish nationalists do. We have a different agenda, and we go about it differently.
And there's a payoff here for Satanology, because we're tempted to think of Satanology in terms of Christian fiction, where we have spiritual warfare, right? Where Satan warfare is about people praying, and then good angels get stronger, and then the bad angels lose to the good angels. Like they take spiritual warfare or battle against Satan, and they make it super spiritual. Mm-hmm. It's all about my temptations to be sinful or not sinful, whether I'm going to lust or not lust, have the affair or not have the affair. And we kind of spiritualize Satan's battles. But in the Gospels, Satan is here allied with how the nations do their business. Yeah. There's a direct connection between the way of the kingdoms of this world advancing through power and pride and the thirst for glory and willing to violently coerce others to yield to their will. How nations do things, that's the game Satan is located in here.
Yeah. And I think you see that most put on display in Revelation. We're not going to have time to get to that today, but that's where you see that, I think, manifest the most. In associating Rome and its lust for wealth and its use of violence and bloodshed to achieve its ends, and that just being, a pawn of Satan, that he's the ultimate mover behind that. And do you really want to align yourself with that? And there's a lot of exegetical payoff, because we as Christians have to ask ourselves, do we want to align ourselves with worldly forces who operate that way? Because John's statement in Revelation is, you're not just aligning yourself with other people around you. You're aligning yourself with the agent behind that, which is Satan. And is that really where you want to go?
Yeah.
I think I'm sorry.
Yeah, that just grows just naturally out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, Satan in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the representative of the kingdoms of the world.
Yeah.
And their power is his power. And it's the very power that is being offered to Jesus in the desert, right?
Yeah.
Where the Dead Sea Scroll community thrived. I mean, and I don't think that's coincidental. I think the categories that are being brought forward here portray him in very much not a Frank Peretti spiritual warfare kind of battle, but a very earthly kingdoms of this world kind of temptation. Yeah. What else did you see in the Gospels that stuck out to you?
I can't answer that question because I have one more thing in my head that if I don't get it out, I'm not going to move on. But
carry on.
Just another exegetically and then in Christian life, how do we view the temptations and testings we encounter in this world? So often we see it as an attack. It's trying to bring me down. It's trying to stop me in my tracks, which to a degree is absolutely true. That's what Satan was trying to do with Jesus. But if we really reframe it as, this is an opportunity for me to show my worth, kind of sounds like in the Lord of the Rings movie with Faramir. That was the test of Faramir. He gets to show his worth, and you guys are looking at me like if you don't, like you don't. Nerd alert, yeah, okay, whatever.
Says the guy with the J.R. Tolkien shirt on. Okay.
Yes, today I'm wearing a J.R. Tolkien shirt, one of many I have. But the idea is that you go through this situation. You're going through this situation not just to get beat down, but to find out what you're made of. And that, yes, God is probably part of the orchestration of this. And so see it as that. When you're going through a difficult time, to say, this is not just me to go enter into warfare against Satan. This is me to show my value, to find out what I'm made of, and to find strength to be victorious in that way.
Yeah. So I think here it might be appropriate to say, while Satan is in this passage certainly associated with the testing/tempting of Jesus, this doesn't mean that all tests and temptations that we experience is the devil's work.
Fair point. Yep.
And this is where I think it's worth reading the passage from James chapter 1. Blessed is anyone who endures temptation. Such a one has stood the test and will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. No one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then, when the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved. And I think the deception here is the deception to say these opportunities to get rich quick are invitations from God, opportunities to advance the kingdom. And no, God's not tempted by that kind of junk. Don't be deceived. Don't associate that with God. This is coming from within you. And while there are other passages that will say, hey, watch out for the devil who will try to tempt you, he's not involved in every single temptation.
Yeah.
Everything we need to be tempted is already within us.
Good point. Very good point.
I think the question is still open, though. Is the Satan figure, as we've been framing him throughout this episode, is he negative or positive or neutral? And I don't know that we have the answer to that, but I think that's a fair question to ask, because does it go back to, well, is negative in the sense that we don't like what he's doing, or is he negative in the sense that he's not doing is he not quite living up to his role that God wants him to do?
Is he like a malevolent force?
Right.
Yeah.
Or, like you say, I mean, even though he's on God's payroll, I don't know. I think that question is still open, especially because it's been ingrained in us from most of us who've gone to church for a long time, that Satan is this terrible, awful figure. Is he terrible because of what he does or what he's trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and this, all we've really talked about is the first instance of the devil in the New Testament. And this is where, when I went through and I classified all the verses that refer to the devil in the Bible, I classified this one as devil as tempter. But this temptation can be seen, I think, as being in total continuity with him as God's agent. Mm-hmm. God's the one who wants Jesus to be tempted. That's why the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. We don't see him. There's no evidence in this passage that he is in opposition to God or God's purposes. And everything that he tempted Jesus with is no more evil than what David was tempted to do, which is to advance his kingdom in a very worldly way when he was incited to take the census. So not enough information yet.
Right.
Which means we're probably going to have to go one more episode on this.
Or 3. Well, we might as well stop there. We're at our time limit approximately, but we hope you've been enjoying this. We are going to continue, hopefully wrap it up next week. And again, if you have any pushback or anything maybe you'd like us to tackle, please feel free to comment on our Facebook page. Well, how do we end? I never get this right. Thanks. John just shook his head. You moron. How hard is it? How many episodes have we done now? Hey, thanks for listening to the After Class podcast, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
This is Mike Harrison, Academic Dean at Great Lakes Christian College. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the podcasters and do not necessarily reflect the official podcast policies of the trustees, administration, faculty, staff, students, alumni, cafeteria staff, maintenance team, vendors, publishers, bus drivers, athletic coaches, pest control, mulchers, dog walkers, field trainers.